And we just heard confirmation there that the teams on the ground, as well as the Axiom-4 crew currently on Dragon and ready for their departure from station, are all go to proceed with today's undocking and departure. So with that go, we are now just awaiting the undocking sequence to actually begin. Again, that undock command is scheduled to be sent in just about 2 minutes from now at 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern. And once that command is sent, it'll take about 5 minutes for Dragon to separate from the International Space Station, with physical separation planned for 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. Dragon's initial departure from station is a little different from other docked vehicles like the Soyuz that rely on springs to push them away from the docking port. Dragon will actually execute 2 short thruster firings called undock burns to physically separate using a combination of the 12 Draco engines around the base of the spacecraft, with the first breaking any stiction between Dragon and the docking port, and the second slowly backing the spacecraft away from the station's Harmony module. Following physical separation, we will have Depart Burn 0, which is the first of 4 departure burns to begin moving Dragon further away from station. Depart Burn 0 will be followed by the second departure burn about 5 minutes later and help move the spacecraft beyond the Keep Out Sphere. The Keep Out Sphere is an invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station, and it is one of several safety zones set up to govern spacecraft arriving and departing the space station. Before moving into the Keep Out Sphere, spacecraft have to be configured where they would not cross the imaginary boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering. About 13 minutes after exiting the Keep Out Sphere, the Dragon will then exit the approach ellipsoid, which is another imaginary shape, this time a 3-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers in the same family as the Keep Out Sphere. One of the key differences with the approach ellipsoid is that vehicles outside of it have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory, which means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours, again, even if it lost all maneuvering. Again, we are now standing by for that undocking sequence to begin in just a few moments at 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern.
Dragon SpaceX on the Big Loop undock sequence commanded.
And we just got confirmation that that undock sequence has been sent, and the umbilicals are now retracting. With that undock command sent, that undocking sequence has now commenced, and that is a roughly 4.5-minute process before we have that physical separation planned for 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern.
Umbilical demate complete and nominal.
We have confirmation that those umbilicals have demated or detached from the space station, and the first set of hooks is now traveling. Again, there are 2 sets of 6 hooks for a total of 12 hard capture hooks that have to unlatch and drive open. After all 12 of those hooks are open, we will then have those very short thruster firings known as undock burns to physically separate from station. We're now just over 1 minute into that undock sequence. Again, that sequence takes about 4.5 minutes total, so about 3.5 minutes to go. In that sequence, the first set of hooks is currently driving open. After that first set is open, we will then stand by for the second set of 6 hooks to open. And then there will be those 2 short thruster firings to physically separate Dragon from the International Space Station. And there on your screen, you are currently seeing a live view inside the SpaceX Mission Control Room in Hawthorne, California, as well as the International Space Station Flight Control Room here in Houston, Texas, as the flight controllers on the ground continue to work in tandem to support today's undocking and departure activities of Axiom-4 crew from the International Space Station. And we are currently in a handover period between satellites, which is why we don't currently have live views of Dragon from space station.
First set of hooks, open and nominal.
And we have confirmation that that first set of 6 hooks has now fully opened, and now the second set of 6 hooks is beginning to retract. After that second set of hooks opens, we will then have those short thruster firings and have physical separation. We are now about 4 minutes into that autonomous undocking sequence that began at 6:10 a.m. Central, 7:10 a.m. Eastern. We are standing by for physical separation here in just under a minute at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern, once the final set of 6 hooks has fully retracted.
All hooks now open and nominal.
And Dragon Grace has
Dragon separation confirmed.
Dragon Grace has officially undocked from the International Space Station at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern, as the orbiting laboratory was flying 260 statute miles over the east coast of India. We also have confirmation that the first departure burn of the 4 departure burns is underway. And that first departure burn has completed.
Performance nominal.
And then the next departure burn, depart burn 1, will take place in about 5 minutes. After that departure burn is complete, Dragon will cross the keep out sphere. And with the undocking about a minute ago at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern, the Axiom-4 crew comprised of the Axiom-4 crew comprised of Peggy Whitson, Shubhanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznański-Wisniewski, and Tibor Kampu have completed their 18-day stay aboard the International Space Station. Following the physical separation, we did have the first depart burn complete, known as depart burn 0. That was a short firing of Dragon's Draco thrusters, and it lasted approximately 16 seconds. And that burn was to increase the speed that Dragon is flying away from the station and send it further away from the orbiting laboratory. That departure burn will be followed
Houston Station,
about 3 minutes.
thrusters are enabled.
Houston copies.
The depart burn 0 will be followed by the second departure burn in just about 3 minutes around 6:20 a.m. Central, 7:20 a.m. Eastern, known as depart burn 1, and that will help move the spacecraft beyond the keep out sphere. And just a moment ago, you were hearing some communication between the Capcom or capsule communicator here in Mission Control Houston and the crew aboard the International Space Station. Currently on board the International Space Station, NASA astronaut Anne McClain was on tap to monitor and support Dragon's departure activities today. So once that second departure burn is completed in a couple of minutes from now, the Dragon and Axiom-4 crew will move beyond the keep-out sphere, and the keep-out sphere is that invisible 200-meter line.
AX4 crew wants to thank you very much for your support. You guys are amazing.
And you just heard some kind words from Axiom-4 commander thanking the flight control team for all of their support throughout their 18-day mission.
Our friendship and goodwill forever be an example of the good that results from shared optimism. Axiom-4, Godspeed, and safe journey home to the best planet in the solar system.
Great copies.
And some additional congratulatory and departure words from the International Space Station crew to the Axiom-4 crew on board Dragon as it continues its departure from the International Space Station. Again, we had that physical separation take place about 4 minutes ago at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. And we are standing by for the second in a series of 4 departure burns to take place in about 1 minute from now, and this will push the Dragon spacecraft and the Axiom-4 crew beyond the keep-out sphere. That keep-out sphere is the invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station, and it is one of several safety zones set up to govern spacecraft arriving and departing from the space station. Before moving into the keep-out sphere, spacecraft have to be configured where they would not cross the imaginary boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering. We are now about 10 seconds away from that second departure burn. Dragon is currently about 80 meters away from the International Space Station as it continues its departure. And depart burn 1, again, that second departure burn in a series of 4 is now underway, and it'll last about 20 seconds.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, depart burn 1 complete and nominal. You are go to doff suits per procedure 4.012.
Nominal departure and 4012 for Dragon.
And we just had confirmation there that that second departure burn, known as depart burn 1, has completed, and it was executed as expected. The crew is now going to start doffing or removing their spacesuits and getting settled in for their 22.5-hour journey back to Earth, again with that splashdown targeted for tomorrow morning, July 15th, off the coast of California. And as a reminder, just like during its approach to the International Space Station, Dragon's departure and deorbit is designed to be fully autonomous, requiring no action from the crew on board. However, unlike Dragon's arrival, there are no hold points during the departure sequence, therefore it takes a lot less time to leave the vicinity of the space station than to arrive. So we just had confirmation of that second departure burn being completed, and that is the second in a series of 4. However, it's the only one that was left within the vicinity of the space station. The next departure burn will take place about 45 minutes from now after Dragon is well on its way back to Earth and outside of the approach ellipsoid. Dragon is now about 195 meters away from the International Space Station and should be crossing the keep out sphere momentarily. And we just heard confirmation that Dragon has exited the keep out sphere. Again, the keep out sphere is an invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station. It's one of several safety zones set up to govern spacecraft arriving and departing from the International Space Station. While spacecraft are inside the keep out sphere, they have to be configured where they would not cross into the imaginary boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering. The next major milestone for Dragon's departure will be exiting the approach ellipsoid. This is planned to take place about 13 minutes from now.
Dragon, Station Houston on the Big Loop. Dragon has exited the keep out sphere.
Dragon copies.
Station copies.
Station looks beautiful.
Dragon Grace, if we didn't have a shutter constraint, you could see us waving.
All right, Grace copies.
So now that Dragon has exited the keep out sphere, the next major milestone for Dragon is crossing the approach ellipsoid. That will take place a little over 10 minutes from now. That approach ellipsoid is another imaginary shape similar to the keep out sphere, but this time it's a 3-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. And one of the key differences with the approach ellipsoid is that vehicles outside of it have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. This means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours, even if it lost all maneuvering. After the spacecraft crosses the approach ellipsoid, joint operations will end and responsibility for the spacecraft will be handed back to the SpaceX flight control team in Hawthorne, California. Again, everything continuing to look good with Dragon's departure today following a physical separation about 10 minutes ago at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. Dragon is now about 340 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to increase that distance. And teams on the ground will continue to monitor the weather ahead of a splashdown tomorrow, Tuesday, July 15th at 5:31 a.m. Eastern off the coast of California. After Dragon exits the approach ellipsoid, there will be a couple of more departure burns and phasing burns to set the spacecraft up for the correct phasing and location for splashdown. And for those of you who are just joining us, the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft carrying the Axiom-4 crew recently undocked from the International Space Station's Harmony module at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern to complete an 18-day stay aboard the orbiting laboratory.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. Johnny, please give Huntsville a call on Space to Ground 4.
Dragon lifted off atop a Falcon 9 rocket on Wednesday, June 25th from Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida and docked to the space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module after a 28-hour journey on Thursday, June 26th. During their stay aboard the International Space Station, the Axiom-4 crew conducted more than 60 experiments, and they will now be returning to Earth with more than 580 pounds of science and hardware. This was the 4th private astronaut mission to the International Space Station enabled by NASA. And while Dragon and the Axiom Mission 4 crew continue their departure from station, and as we stand by for the approach ellipsoid exit in just under 10 minutes from now, let's go ahead and check back in with Jesse and John in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Anna. We've got some great live views here. Previously, we didn't have any live views because we had a loss of signal, which is normal as we are passing by several ground stations. We're now passing over a ground station where we do have acquisition of signal and getting these great live views. Also, in your bottom right-hand corner, you can follow along with this new graphic and see the thrusters firing on Dragon on the forward bulkhead, as well as the telemetry in the bottom left-hand corner. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Dragon is fully autonomous, which means it's capable of flying itself. Dragon was designed from the beginning for flying humans to space, even though its first missions carried only cargo. Now, before we could fly humans, our teams implemented a number of design upgrades to make sure that both Dragon and Falcon 9 are suitable for flying people, and then put both vehicles through thousands of tests to prove their safety. Now, prior to the Axiom Mission 4, SpaceX successfully completed 52 flights of Dragon to and from orbit since 2010, including 47 trips to the International Space Station. Axiom-4 is SpaceX's 18th human spaceflight mission, and before Axiom Mission 4, SpaceX had flown 66 crew members, meaning that this mission brings that count to 70.
That's incredible. You know, missions like this are important milestones for everyone involved, from the crew members who fly, to those that they represent, and to the host of scientists and engineers around the world who have an opportunity for their research or their technology to be tested in microgravity. Everyone learns from these missions. And for Axiom Space, this is at the heart of why we do these missions. We are building opportunities for others to advance what is possible and expand what is known. We want to enable every human everywhere to take part in this. Now, after a beautiful launch on June 25th, the AX-4 crew docked with the International Space Station a little over a day later, opening the hatch and greeting the Expedition 73 crew on June 26th. The crew shared some good words and a welcoming ceremony before quickly getting to work on their extensive itinerary. Now, each crew member brought with them a host of research, technology demonstrations, and outreach objectives, ranging from human physiology to space radiation impact studies, and even some gardening. Now, this crew maintained a very full timeline, but they prepared for this. Each crew member wanted to ensure that every minute of this mission was utilized well and that all objectives were hit. So Peggy, Shooks, Suave, and Tibor were ready to work. And over the course of 18 days on board the station, they accomplished over 60 research activities, as well as more than 20 outreach events. And as their time on station came to a close, the AX-4 crew participated in a brief farewell ceremony where they said their goodbyes to the Expedition 73 crew. Now, for more details on the incredible work performed by this crew on orbit, check out axiomspace.com.
Now, at this time, the crew is getting closer to reaching the approach ellipsoid, so let's head back to Anna at Johnson Space Center to step through these next moments. How's it going, Anna?
Thanks, Jesse and John, and thank you for that update. We are continuing to stand by for Dragon to exit the approach ellipsoid. We are expecting that exit to take place about 3 minutes from now, around 6:34 a.m. Central, 7:34 a.m. Eastern. Dragon is currently about 700 meters away from the International Space Station, following a physical separation about 16 minutes ago at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern. The approach ellipsoid is one of several safety zones set up to govern spacecraft arriving and departing from the International Space Station, similar to the keep-out sphere, which Dragon exited about 10 minutes ago at 6:21 a.m. Central, 7:21 a.m. Eastern. But unlike the keep-out sphere, which is an invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station, the approach ellipsoid is a three-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. When a spacecraft is outside the approach ellipsoid, they have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. This means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours again, even if it lost all maneuvering. And after the crew and Dragon exited the keep-out sphere about 10 minutes ago, we heard that the crew was beginning to step through procedures to take off their spacesuits and settle in for their roughly 22.5-hour journey until a splashdown off the coast of California tomorrow, Tuesday, July 15th. We are just continuing to stand by for confirmation of approach ellipsoid exit. Once Dragon exits the approach ellipsoid, the team here in Mission Control Houston will continue to monitor every step of the way, but prime responsibility once they exit that boundary will be transferred to the SpaceX and Axiom space teams. Dragon is now about 860 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to increase that distance between the two vehicles. And we're now about a minute away from exiting the approach ellipsoid. For those of you who are just joining us, we began our coverage of the Axiom mission for departure activities earlier this morning with hatch closure. That hatch close took place around 4:07 a.m. Central, 5:07 a.m. Eastern. The crew donned or put on their spacesuits and settled in for the departure activities.
I have you loud and clear on the cabin mic.
And we did just hear confirmation that Dragon has exited the approach ellipsoid.
On the big loop, I copied you loud and clear on the cabin mic. Dragon is also outside of the approach ellipsoid and is now on a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. You can configure comm on Dragon to ground in preparation for disabling the big loop.
Dragon copies all and configuring comms for Dragon to ground.
Now that Dragon and the Axiom Mission 4 crew have exited the approach ellipsoid, that means the vehicle is now on a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory, which means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours again, even if it lost all maneuvering. So now that the crew and Dragon have exited the approach ellipsoid, they are settling in for their journey back to Earth. That journey will take about 22 more hours until they splash down.
Is reconnected and powered on.
Houston copies.
The journey will take about 22 more hours until they splash down off the coast of California tomorrow, Tuesday, July 15th at 4:31 a.m. Central, 5:31 a.m. Eastern. Now that Dragon has exited the approach ellipsoid, the team here in Mission Control Houston will continue to monitor, but prime responsibility for the spacecraft and the crew are going to be transferred to the SpaceX and Axiom space teams. We also heard that they are working on steps to deconfigure the big loop. That big loop was configured earlier today during those hatch close operations, and it is a joint communication loop between NASA, SpaceX, the International Space Station crew, and the Dragon crew during joint operations. Now that Dragon has successfully exited the approach ellipsoid, our joint coverage will come to a close as responsibility of the spacecraft and crew is now in the hands of SpaceX and Axiom Space. But thank you so much for joining us this morning for our coverage of hatch closure as well as our coverage of undocking for the Axiom Mission 4 crew. With that, I will go ahead and hand it back over to Jesse and John in Hawthorne, California as we